Governor, thanks very much for speaking with CNBC. Obviously, the change from 8-1 to 6-3 has the market now trying to get its head around how quickly 3 members of the committee decided that 50 basis points might be appropriate. I wonder if you could just help us understand the nature of the conversations and exchanges that took place, the characterization of why it was felt necessary now for 50 basis points rather than the 25 that actually the committee has delivered.
Well, obviously, first of all, I have to say personally, because I was one of the people who voted for 25, so I'm having to put myself into the sort of the position of those who didn't. I mean, I think, first of all, let me just say about the MPC. We meet every broadly 6 weeks. And one of the great strengths of the MPC process is that we reevaluate every time. We take on board all the data, information, intelligence we get in the meantime. And so, I know and my colleagues, we start again in that sense and completely go across the whole sort of sweep of information. So obviously, it follows from that people can adapt and change their views. I mean, I think that let me sort of then put it into the perspective of the last 6 weeks. I mean, we've obviously had one huge event in the last, well, more than 6 weeks, but I mean, it's gone on now, which is obviously the terrible events in Ukraine. These have had effects on prices in this country, I mean, particularly energy prices, but also food prices, because Ukraine is a major global food producer. And unfortunately, that is pushing up the outlook for inflation. It's causing an even bigger shock to real incomes in this country. And as I've said before, we're walking this very narrow path now between these two things. And different members of the committee will view the sort of the distribution of the two sides of the path differently. I would also note that on the question of what guidance we give, there were other members of the committee who took a view the other way and said we should probably rein back the guidance because they think that maybe this path this path of rising interest rate is more nearly done in that sense. So you've got to see it through that lens. I think that we've got these historic events going on, sadly pushing up inflation, and each member of the committee has to sort of, in a sense, reach their own evaluation of what the most sensible setting of policy is in that context. So, some of us felt the best thing was to continue, another gradual step of 25 basis points, and then next time we'll come back and completely reevaluate the thing again. And some other of my colleagues felt that it was appropriate at this point to do more.
There were 2 really big numbers that stood out for me. One was the 10% inflation number, and the other, I think, was the 5.75% wage growth by the end of this year. I think the bit the market is struggling with here is trying to understand how 1% is an appropriate number for interest rates, for policy rates right now, given that they both imply a much higher level of inflation going forward, well above the 2% target that you're aiming for. Shouldn't you be front-loading here, and shouldn't the 50 basis points have happened?
Well, I think it's important to put that into the context of the shock that we're seeing. We're seeing this unprecedentedly large shock to real income in this country coming from abroad. It's a terms of trade shock. That is having a negative effect on real income. We think that is going to feed through to activity, during the course of this year in a big way. We're already seeing, I think, some signs of that in the sort of the consumer side. There's a very large gap now between consumer and business confidence in this country. So that I think the answer to the question, what does monetary policy do, actually has to start with what is going to be the impact of this shock. We think the impact of this shock, in terms of pushing down activity, pushing down inflation, is going to be much bigger. And therefore, how we sort of calibrate the monetary policy response needs to take that into account. And that's why I perfectly sort of see your line of argument, which is you've got inflation going up, much is higher. Why aren't you doing a lot more? Our view is you have to put that into the context of the shock. And as I explained in my remarks earlier today, I think you have to distinguish the shocks that we're seeing here from the shocks that the US is seeing and the shocks that the euro area is seeing. We're a bit of an intermediate case, I think.
Do you think then that the message, the more subtle message you're actually sending here, is that you're more worried about the growth dilemma or challenge for the rest of this year than perhaps the policy announcement would imply?
Well, I'm very worried about inflation, let's be clear. And our primary objective, of course, is inflation, but it's actually inflation in a medium-term setting, because we can't, in a sense, cancel out every shock as it happens. That policy doesn't do that. So I am worried. I mean, inflation is very much amongst my concerns. But in thinking about how we respond to it, we have to look at the shock the economy is facing and what effect that shock is going to have. And it is going to have a substantial effect on activity and demand and therefore growth.